The silver spacecraft descended through Earth's atmosphere, its sleek hull reflecting the morning sunlight. Inside, Commander Actel nervously adjusted his translating device and checked his environmental suit readings for the fifth time. As an experienced Galactic Federation official, he had visited hundreds of worlds, but something about Earth made him uneasy. The ship landed softly on a designated pad near the United States Military Academy. Through the view screen, Actel saw a simple concrete landing area surrounded by old stone buildings. He blinked his 4 eyes in confusion. Where was the advanced technology? Where were the plasma shields and quantum barriers he expected from a species advancing toward space travel? "This can't be right," he muttered to his assistant. "These structures are made of rocks and processed plant material." His assistant checked the coordinates again. "Yes, Commander. This is their premier military training facility. The humans call it the Academy." Actel's scaled skin shifted colors slightly, showing his disappointment. The Galactic Federation had sent him to evaluate Earth's military capabilities after their recent achievement of faster-than-light travel. But based on this first impression, he already had doubts about their readiness. The landing ramp extended with a soft hiss, and Earth's thin atmosphere filled his suit's filters. A small group of humans waited below, standing perfectly still in neat rows. They wore dark blue uniforms with shining metal pieces on their chests. Actel noticed they didn't carry weapons, which was either very foolish or very confident. A tall human with gray hair stepped forward as Actel descended the ramp. "Commander Actel, welcome to Earth. I'm Director James Miller." The human's voice was steady, his face showing what Actel's cultural database identified as a smile. Actel towered over the human by at least 2 feet, his armored environmental suit making him even more impressive. Yet Director Miller showed no signs of fear or nervousness. Most species Actel encountered either cowered or displayed aggressive posturing during first meetings. "Director Miller," Actel said through his translator, "I must admit, I expected something different." Miller's smile grew wider. "Many do, Commander. Shall we begin the tour? Our cadets are about to start their morning routine." As they walked, Actel noticed more strange things. The paths between buildings were made of simple stone. Young humans in exercise clothes ran past them, their feet hitting the ground in rhythmic patterns. They barely glanced at the alien visitors. "Aren't they curious about me?" Actel asked, puzzled by their focus. "Oh, they're curious," Miller replied, "but they've learned discipline. Right now, their training takes priority over their curiosity." They entered a building that Actel's scanner said was over 200 years old. Inside, the walls displayed images of past battles and old weapons. Miller stopped at one showing humans fighting with primitive projectile weapons. "Commander, I know you're here to evaluate our readiness for the Galactic Federation," Miller said, his voice turning serious. "You probably expected quantum arrays and plasma cannons. But here's something you should understand about humans. We don't just teach our warriors how to use advanced technology. We teach them to think, adapt, and survive with whatever tools they have." Actel processed this information. In all his years of evaluating species, he'd never encountered this approach. Most races rush to adopt the most advanced weapons they could find. But how can you prepare for modern warfare with such basic methods? Actel asked. Miller checked his watch. "It's almost dawn, Commander. Why don't I show you instead of telling you? Our first-year cadets are about to begin their morning exercises. I think you'll find it quite enlightening." As they walked toward the training grounds, Actel heard a sound that made his scales ripple, hundreds of human voices shouting in unison, their combined force echoing off the ancient stone walls. Maybe, he thought, there was more to these humans than he initially assumed. The morning air was bitter cold, with frost coating the grass of the training field. Commander Actel checked his suit's temperature readings, -2 degrees Celsius. His eyes widened as he watched young human cadets gathering on the field wearing nothing but thin exercise uniforms. "Director Miller, surely this is dangerous for them," Achtel's translator conveyed his concern. Most species require careful temperature control for physical activities. Miller stood calmly, his breath visible in the cold air. Watch. The cadets lined up in perfect formation as their instructor, a muscular man named Roberts, began barking orders. To Achtel's shock, the humans started running. Not toward shelter, but in organized lines around the frost-covered field. Remarkable. Achtel's assistant whispered, recording vital signs. Their bodies are actually generating heat through movement. After 10 minutes of running, none of the cadets showed signs of stopping. Instead, they began performing what Miller called jumping jacks and push-ups. Their bodies moved in perfect synchronization, steam rising from their warming forms into the cold morning air. In many worlds, Achtel observed, we use simulation chambers for physical training. Environmental hazards are considered unnecessary risks. Miller nodded. We have those too. But there's something about real cold, real pain, real struggle that simulators can't replicate. Watch what happens next. The instructor shouted new orders, and the cadets broke into smaller groups. They began lifting heavy objects, logs, weighted bars, and sandbags. Their faces showed strain, but none stopped or complained. Their muscles are working at near maximum capacity, Achtel's assistant reported, studying the readings. By Federation standards, this would be classified as physical distress. A young cadet nearby dropped his log. Without hesitation, 2 others stopped their own exercises to help him lift it. Once he had it back up, they returned to their own tasks. Achtel noticed the fallen cadet didn't leave the training field or receive medical attention. He failed, Achtel stated. Should he not be removed from training? Miller smiled. Failed? No, Commander. He struggled, yes. But look, he's still going. In fact, he'll probably work harder now. We don't expect perfection. We expect persistence. The morning grew colder as clouds blocked the rising sun. The instructor called out something that made all the cadets gather equipment. Achtel assumed the session was ending due to the worsening weather. He was wrong. The cadets strapped heavy packs to their backs and began a fast march toward a distant hill. The wind picked up, carrying small ice crystals that pinged against Achtel's environmental suit. Surely now they will stop, he said. Commander, Miller replied, watching his cadets with pride. This is just the warm-up. They'll march 10 kilometers with those packs, then begin their daily classes. Some will be tired. Some will be sore. All will be back tomorrow to do it again. Achtel's assistant frantically recorded data. Sir, these readings, the physical stress levels, the environmental exposure, the sustained exertion. By Federation standards, this would qualify as an endurance test, not a daily routine. Standards, Miller mused, watching the cadets disappear into the icy morning, their cadence calls still audible in the distance. That's an interesting word, Commander. Your Federation has many standards. For technology, for civilization, for military capability. But I wonder if you've ever considered that your standards might be limited. Achtel stood silently, his 4 eyes tracking the disappearing humans. In all his years evaluating species for Federation membership, he'd never seen anything like this. These humans weren't just training their bodies. They were forging something else. Something that couldn't be measured by his instruments or compared to Federation standards. Director Miller, he said finally, I believe I need to completely reconsider my evaluation parameters. Miller's eyes twinkled. Good, because what you've seen so far, that's nothing compared to their combat training, which, if you're ready, begins in 1 hour. As they walked back toward the academy buildings, Achtel found himself deeply troubled by a new thought. What kind of species chooses to make themselves stronger by embracing discomfort? And more importantly, what happens when such a species takes its place among the stars? Commander Achtel's environmental suit registered multiple impacts against the reinforced observation window. Red dots splattered across the transparent barrier, training markers that simulated weapon fire. Below, in what the humans called the pit, two groups of cadets engaged in simulated urban combat. Fascinating, Actel muttered, watching the cadets move through the mock city streets. They're using projectile weapons, yet their movements suggest familiarity with energy weapons as well. Director Miller nodded. We train them with everything from sticks and stones to plasma rifles, though today they're using standard rifles with paint rounds. A cadet rolled behind a concrete barrier just as red marks peppered his previous position. His teammates immediately laid down covering fire, allowing another group to advance. The coordination was impressive, but what caught Actel's attention was the sound. The cadets were laughing. "They're enjoying this?" Actel asked, his scales shifting to a confused purple. "Combat training is serious business," Miller explained, "but humans have a unique ability to find joy in challenge. It helps them learn faster, adapt better." The battle below reached a crescendo as one team successfully flanked the other. The simulation ended with most cadets marked in red paint, their uniforms a testament to the intensity of the exercise. "Now," Miller said, checking his watch, "would you like to see something really interesting?" They moved to another training area where pairs of cadets faced each other on padded mats. Actel's translator picked up the instructor, calling it hand-to-hand combat training. "But they have weapons," Actel said, puzzled. "Why would they need to fight with their bodies?" His question was answered as he watched. Two cadets circled each other, then suddenly exploded into action. One launched a strike, the other blocked and countered. They moved with a speed and precision that made Actel's recording equipment struggle to keep up. "In the Federation," Actel observed, "we consider physical combat primitive, obsolete." A loud thud drew their attention as one cadet threw another to the mat. The fallen cadet immediately jumped up, grinning despite what must have been significant pain. "Again," the instructor shouted. The cadets reset their positions. "Primitive," Miller replied. "Maybe. But what happens when the advanced weapons fail? When the power dies? When all you have is yourself and your training?" Actel watched as the cadets moved to different stations. Some practiced with long wooden sticks, others with rubber knives, and some worked with what looked like ancient projectile weapons, bows and arrows. "Your species confuses me," Actel admitted. "You have mastered faster than light travel, yet you train with sticks. You have energy weapons, yet you practice throwing each other to the ground. You have advanced targeting systems, yet you shoot primitive bows." A sharp crack echoed through the room as a cadet broke a wooden board with their hand. Actel's assistant frantically recorded the force readings. "Commander," Miller said, his voice serious, "do you know what makes humans different from most species we've encountered?" Actel turned all four eyes toward him. "We don't see technology as a replacement for basic skills. We see it as an addition to them. Each cadet here can operate our most advanced systems, but they can also survive with nothing but their training and determination." The training session ended, and the cadets began cleaning the area. Actel noticed how they helped each other treat minor injuries, sharing jokes and encouragement. "Director Miller," Actel said slowly, "in the Federation, we train soldiers to use weapons. You seem to be training weapons that can use anything." Miller smiled. "An interesting observation, Commander. But if you think this is impressive, wait until you see their problem-solving classes. After all, physical combat is just one type of warfare." As they left the training area, Actel heard a cadet ask another, "Ready for psychological warfare studies?" The other cadet grinned. "Always. I hear we're covering Sun Tzu today." Actel made a note to research this Sun Tzu person. Something told him he was about to learn yet another surprising aspect of human military education. Commander Actel found himself in a large classroom, surprisingly traditional with its rows of desks and a simple display screen at the front. The room buzzed with energy as cadets pulled out tablets and notebooks, actual physical paper notebooks, which made his scales ripple in amazement. The instructor, Professor Baker, stood at the front of the room. Unlike the physical training instructors, She wore civilian clothes and had a calm, almost gentle demeanor. This, somehow, made Actel more nervous than the combat trainers. Today, Professor Baker announced, we'll examine the Battle of Thermopylae and its applications to modern psychological warfare. Actel leaned toward Director Miller. Thermopylae, another human weapon system. No, Miller whispered. A battle from ancient history. Just watch. The professor displayed an image of a narrow mountain pass. 300 soldiers, she said, stood against an army of thousands. They knew they would die. Their enemy knew they would die. But those 300 changed the course of history not just through their actions, but through the story they created. The cadets were completely silent, taking notes. Actel noticed how their eyes tracked every movement of their instructor, minds clearly working behind those focused expressions. The Persians had superior numbers, better equipment, more resources, Professor Baker continued. But the Spartans had something more powerful. They controlled the narrative. A cadet raised his hand. Like the Battle of London Bridge. Exactly. Professor Baker's eyes lit up. When 5 humans with basic weapons held off an entire invasion force by convincing them the bridge was heavily mined. They didn't have any mines. They just made the enemy believe they did. Actel's assistant quietly added notes to their report. This was warfare unlike anything in the Federation's manuals. The professor moved to a new topic. Now let's discuss modern applications. How do you control an enemy's perception? How do you make them see what you want them to see? The cadets broke into discussion groups. Actel listened as they debated ways to use information as a weapon, how to turn an enemy's assumptions against them, how to win battles before they began. This is dangerous knowledge, Actel murmured to Miller. Knowledge isn't dangerous, Miller replied. It's neutral. What matters is how you use it. The class shifted to practical exercises. Cadets took turns presenting scenarios and solutions, each more creative than the last. One proposed using environmental data to fake a larger force. Another suggested using an enemy's own cultural beliefs to restrict their tactical options. Sir, Actel's assistant whispered, these humans aren't just studying warfare. They're studying psychology, sociology, culture. They're learning to fight with ideas. Professor Baker drew their attention back to the front. Remember, she said, the strongest weapon in your arsenal isn't your technology, your training, or even your determination. It's your mind. The ability to understand, adapt, and overcome not just physical obstacles, but mental ones. She displayed a quote on the screen. Supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Sun Tzu. Actel asked, remembering the name from earlier. Miller nodded. An ancient human military philosopher. His works are still studied today. As the class ended, Professor Baker assigned their homework. Analyze a historical battle where the numerically or technologically inferior force achieved victory through psychological warfare. The cadets packed up, already discussing their assignments with enthusiasm. One passed close to Actel, and he overheard, I'm going to write about how the humans in Colony 6 made the pirates think their farming equipment was military hardware. Director Miller checked his tablet. We have time for one more stop before lunch. The crisis response training should be starting soon. As they left the classroom, Actel found himself deeply troubled. The Federation evaluated species based on their technology, their military strength, their industrial capacity. But how do you measure a species that turns stories into weapons, that transforms defeat into psychological victory, that teaches its warriors to think as much as fight? Director Miller, he said, I believe I need to update my evaluation criteria again. Miller just smiled. Good, because what comes next might change everything you think you know about human capabilities. Commander Actel stood in the Academy's main dining hall, watching hundreds of cadets gather for their midday meal. His environmental suit's sensors were working overtime, trying to process the variety of languages and dialects filling the air. I don't understand, he said to Director Miller. These cadets, They're from different territories of Earth. Different countries, Miller corrected. Nearly 50 nations are represented here. Some were enemies not too long ago. Actel watched as cadets from various backgrounds sat together, sharing food and conversation. His translator struggled to keep up with the rapid switches between languages. English to Russian, Mandarin to Arabic, French to Spanish. In the Federation, Actel observed, we separate training facilities by species to prevent conflict. Yet here, Miller finished, we bring them together. Watch that table. He pointed to where 4 cadets sat together. The tall one's grandfather fought in Vietnam against the shorter one's grandfather. The one on the left's country was at war with the one on the right's just 40 years ago. Now they're roommates. The cadets in question were laughing together, sharing what Actel's scanner identified as pizza. But how do you prevent tribal conflicts? Actel's assistant asked. Surely they're historical entities. A sudden commotion interrupted them. 2 cadets at another table had stood up, their voices raised. Actel's scales shifted to alert orange, expecting violence. Instead, the argument seemed to be about something called soccer. Madrid will crush Manchester, one shouted. In your dreams, the other replied. Other cadets nearby laughed, and soon both arguers were grinning too. They sat back down, still debating but now sharing a dessert. You see, Miller explained, we don't try to eliminate their differences. We teach them to use those differences as strength. Each cadet brings their own cultural military traditions, their own ways of thinking, their own approaches to problems. They moved through the dining hall, passing tables where cadets were having animated discussions in multiple languages. Some were reviewing morning training sessions, others debating tactical theories, and some were simply sharing stories from home. Watch this, Miller said, leading them to a training schedule posted on the wall. Today's advanced hand-to-hand combat class combines Korean martial arts, Russian combat systems, and Brazilian fighting techniques. Tomorrow, they'll study military strategies from ancient China, medieval Europe, and modern Africa. A group of cadets passed by, discussing their morning psychology lesson in 3 different languages, seamlessly switching between them to find the right words for complex concepts. But what happens, Actel asked, when they return to their own militaries? Surely this sharing of knowledge creates security risks. Miller's expression grew serious. Commander, do you know what happens when our graduates meet each other years later, even if their nations are in conflict? They remember sharing meals, training together, learning together. Sometimes that memory is enough to open diplomatic channels that might otherwise remain closed. Actel watched as a cadet dropped her tray. Before it hit the ground, 3 others, each from a different country, moved to help. They worked together without words, cleaning up the mess and sharing their own food with her. In the Federation, Actel said slowly, we believe unity comes from similarity. But here, Miller finished, we've learned that true unity comes from embracing our differences. Every culture, every language, every tradition adds another tool to our arsenal. The lunch period was ending. Cadets began clearing their tables, moving with the same disciplined efficiency they showed in training. But now Actel noticed something his sensors hadn't picked up before. The way they moved as one unit despite their differences, the way they anticipated each other's needs without speaking. Director Miller, Actel said, his scales shifting to a thoughtful blue. I believe I finally understand why your training methods seemed so primitive at first. You're not just training soldiers, you're building bridges. Miller nodded. And bridges, Commander, are most useful in times of crisis. He checked his watch. Speaking of which, our next stop might demonstrate that rather dramatically. As they left the dining hall, alarms began to sound throughout the academy. Red lights flashed throughout the academy as sirens wailed. Commander Actel's environmental suit automatically adjusted to the sudden increase in noise and movement. Around them, cadets burst into action, moving with purpose rather than panic. "What's happening?" Actol asked, his scales shifting to alert orange. Director Miller remained calm, checking his tablet. Simulated crisis. Category 4 emergency. Multiple simultaneous disasters. Watch how they respond. The dining hall transformed. Cadets instantly organized themselves into teams, their previous lunch conversations forgotten. Actol noticed how they sorted themselves not by country or language, but by skill sets and training. Command center established in Hall B. Someone shouted. Medical teams to the East Wing. Engineering units, prepare for deployment. Actol's assistant frantically recorded as cadets switched seamlessly between roles. Those who had been practicing hand-to-hand combat hours earlier now worked complex communication equipment. Others who had discussed psychological warfare were calculating resource distribution. The scenario, Miller explained as they moved to an observation room, involves an earthquake, a nuclear reactor breach, and a possible hostile force taking advantage of the chaos. Through the observation windows, they watched teams of cadets tackle each crisis. Some worked with virtual displays showing radiation patterns, while others coordinated simulated rescue operations. A group handled communications with panicked virtual civilians in multiple languages. "Look there," Miller pointed to a team working on evacuation routes. The cadet leading that group is from a country prone to earthquakes. Next to him, the one handling nuclear containment is from a nation with extensive nuclear power experience. They're combining their knowledge. Actol watched in amazement as the cadets adapted to rapidly changing conditions. When the simulation threw new challenges, power failures, communication blackouts, sudden resource shortages, they adjusted without hesitation. "Sir," his assistant reported, "their stress levels are elevated, but their coordination is actually improving under pressure." A new alert sounded. The simulation had added hostile forces approaching the disaster area. Without missing a beat, the cadets split their focus. Some continued rescue operations while others organized defense plans. Most impressive, Actol noted, is how they handle multiple problems at once. In Federation training, we focus on one crisis at a time. Life rarely sends challenges one at a time, Miller replied. So we teach them to juggle chaos. The cadets had set up a triage system, treating simulated injuries while simultaneously fortifying defensive positions. They used everything they had learned, physical training, psychological warfare, and their diverse backgrounds, to tackle each new problem. A cadet rushed past with a status report, reactor containment at 60%, civilian evacuation 75% complete. Enemy forces detected in sectors 3 and 7. Actol noticed something remarkable. The cadets weren't just following procedures. They were innovating. When standard protocols failed, they created new solutions. When resources ran short, they found creative alternatives. There, Miller pointed to a screen showing a team using construction equipment as makeshift barriers. They're applying yesterday's lessons about making farming equipment look like military hardware, but in reverse, using civilian tools for defense. The simulation reached its peak. Multiple systems failed simultaneously. The virtual reactor reached critical levels. Enemy forces breached the perimeter. Instead of crumbling, the cadets seemed to work even better under the extreme pressure. "How is this possible?" Actol asked. By Federation standards, this level of crisis should overwhelm them. Miller smiled. "Remember this morning's cold training, the hand-to-hand combat, the psychological warfare classes. It was all preparation for this. Humans don't break under pressure, Commander. We adapt." Finally, the all-clear signal sounded. The cadets had successfully contained the reactor, evacuated civilians, and repelled hostile forces. They gathered for debriefing, immediately analyzing their performance and suggesting improvements. Director Miller, Actol said, his scales now a shade of deep blue respect. "I must know, how often do you run these crisis simulations?" That's the interesting part, Commander. Miller checked his tablet one last time. This wasn't today's scheduled simulation. The real one begins in 10 minutes. As if on cue, new alarms started to sound throughout the academy. Commander Actel sat in his quarters aboard his ship, staring at the blank screen where his final report to the Galactic Federation would soon appear. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence as he gathered his thoughts. The events of the past day at the Human Military Academy played through his mind. "Computer, begin recording," he said finally. "Priority report. Earth military evaluation." His assistant stood quietly in the corner, organizing the day's data. The readings from their sensors told one story, but Actel knew the numbers couldn't capture everything they had witnessed. 2. Galactic Federation High Command. Subject: Human Military Capability Assessment. Classification: Immediate ATTNTION required. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Esteemed council members, I must begin this report with an admission. Our initial assessment parameters for Earth's military capabilities were fundamentally flawed. We have been measuring the wrong things." Through his viewport, he could see the academy buildings below. The morning frost was returning, and he knew those same cadets would soon be out there again, running in the cold. The humans do not fit our traditional evaluation metrics. Their technology, while advancing rapidly, is not their primary strength. Their military hardware, though effective, is not what makes them unique. What sets humans apart is something our sensors struggle to quantify. Actel's scales shifted through various colors as he continued recording. They train their warriors not just to fight, but to think. Not just to use weapons, but to become them. Not just to follow orders, but to adapt when those orders no longer fit the situation. They embrace discomfort as a teacher and turn diversity into strength. He included video clips from the day: cadets running in the freezing morning, combat training, psychological warfare classes, the incredible crisis response exercises. Most concerning, or impressive, depending on one's perspective, is their ability to combine primitive and advanced techniques. A human warrior might be equally comfortable with a stick or a plasma rifle. They train for every scenario, from total technology failure to advanced space combat. His assistant displayed the stress readings from the crisis simulation. The graphs showed how human performance improved under pressure that would break most species. Their training methods appear brutally simple at first glance: cold weather exercises, physical combat, basic weapons. But this simplicity is deceptive. They are not training soldiers to meet standards. They are creating warriors who can exceed them, adapt beyond them, or ignore them completely if necessary. Actel thought about the dining hall, where former enemies sat together sharing meals and knowledge. Perhaps most remarkably, they have turned their greatest potential weakness, their diversity, into their greatest strength. Different cultures, languages, and military traditions don't divide them. Instead, these differences give them multiple approaches to every problem. He added his highest-level security classification to the report: RECOMMEND, immediate admission of Earth into the Galactic Federation, with special notice. Do not underestimate this species. Their current technology level is not an accurate measure of their military capability. They are not trying to meet our standards. They are creating their own. Actel paused again, then added a personal note. Final observation. In my centuries of evaluating species for Federation membership, I have never encountered one that made me question our own military training methods. Until now. Perhaps we have become too reliant on technology, too dependent on standard procedures, too comfortable in our assumed superiority. He looked out the viewport one last time. The sun was rising over the academy, and he could already see cadets gathering for their morning training. In conclusion, the humans have a saying: hope for the best, prepare for the worst. After observing their training methods, I believe we should be very grateful they are interested in becoming our allies, because I would not want them as enemies. End report. Actel commanded. He turned to his assistant. Send this with maximum priority encryption to the High Command. As his ship prepared for departure, Actel watched the morning exercises begin below. In all his years of service, he had never been so sure of one thing. The galaxy was about to change, and these humans, these incredible, adaptable, determined humans, would be at the center of that change. These were not just soldiers they were creating in that ancient academy. They were something new, something the galaxy had never seen before. And the galaxy, ready or not, would have to adapt to them.